Well, good, Mark. It is really good to meet you and to talk with you about your book and a little bit about your background for our audience. And so thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jed. It's a privilege to be here.
Well, the book that I want to share, I'll just hold it up here so people can just get a quick look at it. And it's called How Democrats Can Win Back Men. And the subtitle is Why Understanding Male Voters and Their Issues is Vital for Democratic Victory. Um, I'll just note, because this is a mutual friend, Warren Farrell, I've known for years. He gives a quote on the cover, which I'll just read. It says, How Democrats Can Win Back Men could be the most important book ever written toward both the Democrats winning in 2024 and reversing the loss of men to the Democratic Party in the next decades. So before we get into the book, there's obviously two major areas that you talk about. And I'll just say at the outset that the book
hmm
really says more, although the title, I think, says a lot and offers a lot. But the truth is, the book, I think, really talks even more depth about two interesting issues that I think touch all of our lives. The first is politics,
hmm
and it says a lot about our political world and what's going on in politics. And it also says a lot about men. And you really can't talk about men without talking about women and, our lives and our families. So maybe you could start by just saying a little bit about your own background. How did you first get interested in politics?
All right. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I've been an engaged citizen since I turned 18 back in 1988. So, yeah, I voted every election. I've never run for office, but I've volunteered for a lot of campaigns, spoken at City Hall, done the door knocking, done the phone banking, all that good stuff. So, I would call myself an engaged citizen. And that's just something I've always cared about, just cared about my community. Worked with community groups in the different neighborhoods that I've lived in over the years. And just, I think that's just important for all of us for a successful democracy, for people to have their voice heard, even though I understand sometimes that can be very frustrating because there's so many different voices out there. Sometimes you don't feel like your voice is heard. And I've also, been an advocate for male well-being for a long time as well. And you asked me, how did that get started? You mentioned Warren Farrell in the introduction. When his book, The Myth of Male Power, came out in the 1990s, before that book came out, I had this feeling. I kept talking to people like, I don't understand. I feel like I'm living in the twilight zone. I'm seeing men are having all these issues and yet they're completely not talked about. I didn't understand it. And I was getting a little frustrated. And I read that book. I literally stayed up the whole night, read the whole book. I was crying as I like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. Somebody else
Mm.
is writing about this. I was just so grateful to have that. So ever since then, I've been involved with various men's groups, either political groups or just, just other groups, men's groups. And so this book is kind of a merge, exactly right, of those two interests of politics and the male issues. And I felt like it's been kind of coming for a while that the men's issues have not really been making center stage, and this has been the year for it. So it was the right year for me to write this book. I had my finger on the pulse this year because men's issues and gender issues in general have been a big part of this election.
Yeah. Well, thanks. That's certainly a good overview introduction of your background. It certainly touches on my interests. For me, I first got involved with men's issues with the birth of my first son, and that was November 21st, 1969. And when I held Jamal in my arms for the first time, and I made a promise to him that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me, and to do everything I could to help create a world where men were fully healed, fully engaged with their families throughout their lives. And, it was something that at the time was not happening very much when I started Men Alive shortly after our first son was born, and then my daughter after that. There just weren't very many people that were focus particularly on men's issues, although clearly men had a lot of issues and a lot of problems, but there was a lot of focus on women and women's health issues. And we certainly see this in the current political atmosphere. Women's issues. If you're a Democrat, we saw that as I watched the the Democratic National Gathering, political gathering, and there was a lot of focus on women, which was great. I have daughters, I have a wife, I care about women, and I think most men do. But it was very noticeable that there was a lot of focus on women and not much focus on men and men's issues. And
Yeah.
so part of what your book, I think, brings out in a very powerful way, which I'd like you to talk a bit about, is what are some of the major issues that are facing males, boys and men, that really haven't been talked about or haven't been focused on as much, and many people, even who are involved in the healing professions or in working with men, don't know some of these basic facts that many of which have kind of come out in recent years.
Yeah. Well, the first one I always like to point to is the fact that men's life expectancy is now 5.9 years less than women. So that is such a difference. It's been growing. COVID made it even worse because men have been more likely to die of COVID. And, even Harvard Magazine, they wrote an article about this and they were quoted saying, this is something we don't exactly know why it's happening and we need to do more research into this. So just the fact that men are dying almost 6 years earlier than women, I think that's a fact that most people don't even realize that, and it hasn't always been that way. Not so long ago, the life expectancy gap was only 1 year at the turn of the previous century. Now it's 6 years. So there's no law that says men have to die 6 years earlier than women, and I think we should be mindful of that. Another item that's really important is education. Boys are dropping out of school. They feel unwelcome at school. Boys are now less likely to graduate from high school, less likely to go to college, and young men are less likely to graduate from college. Only 40% of current college students are men. That's a really big gap. And in fact, when Title IX came out in 1972, just before that, the gap, it was reversed. There were more men in college and fewer women, and it was seen this was something that was needed to help try to balance the scales a little bit. But now it's been swapped, and it's the other way. So, education, I think, is an extremely important one. Home ownership. About 2 million more single women own their homes than men, which is an incredible
Mm.
number, extremely high. There's also something called male deaths of despair, which are the type of deaths that include suicide, alcoholic liver disease, and opioid overdose, which is something that's gotten worse and worse over the last few years in particular. And, in 2022, in that 1 year alone, over 130,000 men in the United States died from those deaths of despair. That's over twice the number of servicemen killed in all of Vietnam in just 1 year right here in our own country. And these are all preventable deaths. So, men and boys are really struggling. There's a loneliness epidemic. And, when you see these unfortunate school shootings, which I think is every parent's worst nightmare, it's probably like, something happening at their school. The vast majority of these shootings are boys or young men who are committing these. And I think that is unfortunately a symptom the fact that our boys are just not doing well right now. So we've got all this data. We've got all these outcomes, these poor social outcomes for men and boys. And it's time that we need to step up in the political arena and acknowledge it and act on it.
Well, it's so important. And I know, as a psychotherapist, as somebody who's worked in the men's health, gender medicine field for, in my case, over 50 years, I know how important these issues are and how much they really impact everybody's lives. I worked for a time in the schools helping, uh, started out helping girls in high school get more connected because they were having difficulty in schools. And I worked with some of the women at the school. And one of the things that the high school girls said, and really struck me was as we were looking at what could be most helpful to them, what they were saying was the single thing that they wanted more than anything else was for us to work with the boys. That if you could work with the boys, the girls' lives would be much better and much healthier. And we see that too at all ages. You know,
Hmm.
I'm getting on in years. I'm in my 80s now. And as you point out, the suicide statistics, you well know that the deaths of despair and particularly suicides, which is probably the single most salient indicator of despair when somebody says and acts on the desire to end their life, that it's always discrepant between males and females, even at younger ages where you don't have a lot of young boys or girls killing themselves. It still is predominantly boys. And as they get older, the discrepancy in suicide rate is even higher for
Hmm.
males in their 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. As we get older, the suicide rate, for instance, for males compared to females in their 70s and 80s is 8 to 17 times higher for males than for females. And obviously, males and females are facing some of the same health problems, some of the same difficulties, but males are taking their lives at much higher rates. And I think every woman who I work with in counseling will tell you, again, similar to the young girls, if there was one thing we could do to help their lives, it would be to help the men, because when men die, women are left. When men die too soon, their wives, their partners, their spouses and loved ones are left. So this is not just a men's issue, I think, is part of the message. And that when we really talk with women, we recognize that anything we can do to help males are going to help women and children as well. Do you find that true?
Absolutely. I mean, I like to think of it as the fact that we are all interconnected. And so, therefore, we all need to support each other. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge, as you did earlier, that we can support multiple groups of people in meaningful ways at the same time. We can support women's issues. We can support women's reproductive choice, and also acknowledge, guess what, men have some reproductive choice issues that we also need to talk about too, and that's okay. And by talking about both doesn't diminish us talking about the other.
So important. And obviously now at this time we're facing another election. And the choice, I think everybody would agree that there's a real choice between the two candidates and the two political parties, and whichever uh, part of the spectrum you're on, I think you'd agree that this is an important election. And I think both sides and every place in the middle would agree that there are great divides between our people in our country, and a great feeling that that we're divided and can't seem to agree on many things. And yet in our lives, I think we recognize that we really are together in many things. So one of the things I'd like you to speak to, because it's, I think, a fairly unique contribution, at least that I've seen in anything that I've seen written, is really recognizing and documenting the shift in focus and voting preference by gender. That there seems to be a divide, and the divide is getting greater. Could you talk about that gender divide and how it seems to be playing out in the political parties that we have in this country?
Absolutely. So if you go back to the early 70s, I like to look at about the last 50 years because I think that's kind of the modern time frame. And in 72, men and women voted very similarly and overwhelmingly for Nixon. Then Watergate happened, which compared to some of the scandals today, it doesn't seem like that big a deal. But at the time, it was a huge deal.
Sure.
Everyone, men and women in lockstep, voted for Carter, but only by about 5%. But still, men and women were about the same. And then it was 1980 when Ronald Reagan was elected the first time. That's when we first saw the gender gap. And in fact, it was Ronald Reagan's advisor, a man named Richard Worthland, who is the one who is credited with coming up with that term, the gender gap, to address the gender gap in voting. And so then in 84, that gap just got even bigger. And it has been more or less the same as maybe growing somewhat since then. And we've seen Democrats are attracting more women and Republicans are attracting more men. And this has been pretty standard. There have only been a couple of Democratic presidents who've even won among men since Carter. And one of them was Bill Clinton in 1992. And part of the reason he did so well among men is because it was this very strong third party candidate named Ross Perot who siphoned some votes off. So compared to Republicans, the Democrats did really well that election. And then in 2008, when Barack Obama ran, you got to remember where we were. There was a global financial collapse. People were worried the global economy is going to collapse. We were in two unpopular, drawn-out wars. And even with all that, Barack Obama managed to get just barely +1 among men. So it's been pretty strong, and I think it's something that the Democratic Party is starting to figure out, but they are not properly addressing it. And I would say the number one thing is, first of all, I go to the party platforms, okay, because this is their message to the world. Here's what we believe. We put it in paper. We have a group of people. We put it together, and you got to assume it's approved by whoever is leading the party at that time. And we've seen the same thing for 2016, 2020, and 2024. There are numerous supportive issues for women and girls in these platforms, and virtually nothing for men and boys. The word boys doesn't even appear in the 2024 Democratic Party platform. And in fact, they mentioned the word women 82 times. They mentioned the word men only 4 times. And the 4 times that they mentioned the word men, 3 of them are just in the phrase men and women. And once is in complaining, they're properly criticizing Trump for hiring 3/4 male judges and say it wasn't enough of a balance among the judges who were hired. Okay, that's a valid point. That's great. But that's not a supportive issue for men and boys, right? So so basically that's it. There's no other mention of men. So the entire platform, all these issues we were talking about earlier, deaths of despair, poor educational outcomes, etc., those aren't even mentioned ever in the document. And if you listen to, President Biden this year in the State of the Union, he doesn't mention any of these issues. If you look at the budget for next year, it doesn't mention any of these issues. So I've just been very frustrated with the Democratic Party and the fact that they have not been able to address these issues directly. I've got some theories as to why, since I've been doing my research, but I think it's very sad that they feel like they can't address men's issues because that will alienate women, they think.
Well, it's, from my experience, that issue is one not just in the United States. I work internationally, and there seems to be a similar divide in many other countries of females going more towards the more liberal end of the spectrum, whatever the parties are, and males
Mm-hmm.
going the other way, and male issues often being neglected as female issues, very rightly so, or being heightened and concentrated on more. And it isn't just in politics that we see this. We see this kind of neglect in other areas. So you
Yep.
said you could speculate, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about why this is, and then we'll talk about how that shows itself and what might change that. But why do you think in kind of our current world, and let's stay with the United States since that's where we are and that's what your book
Mm-hmm.
is focusing on particularly, why do you think it is that men's issues are neglected? The surface seems to be men rule a lot of our world,
Yep.
and yet men's issues and just in a sense the bread and butter issues, the things people are most concerned about, are not being addressed in a significantly balanced way.
Exactly. And what you just mentioned, the fact that all presidents have been men, so therefore men can't have any issues, right? That's what's called as the apex fallacy. I've heard it called that. That's just a belief that just because there are more men in leadership position, in fact, all presidents, three-quarters of Congress, and 90% of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, something like that, that means that the men who are homeless don't have to worry. I mean, what help does it do to somebody who's living under the I-80 bridge in Oakland, who's a man, just because President Biden happens to be the same biological sex as him? Does that give him some sort of advantage when he's living, homeless underneath a bridge? I don't think so. And I think that that is one of the biggest just kind of mental blocks to get over. And second, I think a lot of people just don't know the data, and they will often hear something that happens to a friend of theirs or someone they know or a family member, and they just think of that as a one-off thing. And then you say, yeah, but this is part of a pattern. Oh, my son had this problem. He just dropped out of school. Okay, so this is a pattern that boys are dropping out of school. It's not just your son, right? This is a pattern that and for some reason, people have a hard time kind of putting that together, because I think there's been a very strong women's movement since the 1960s, which has done a great job of messaging about women's issues, as you mentioned. And I think that just there hasn't been a clear enough sort of understanding of the issues that men face and understand that they're systemic. And I think those are a couple of reasons why that hasn't happened.
Yeah, another thought that I have, see what you think about this, is as a psychotherapist and psychologist, I think many of us, and maybe most of us, grew up with a kind of male type ethic that says we don't complain about things. We're tough. If there's a problem, we deal with it ourselves.
Yep.
So not only don't we complain, but we are kind of conditioned to solve our problems by ourselves. So we don't organize with other men very well because, one, we shouldn't complain and we should deal with it ourselves. And so part of what I've seen in the 50 years I've been doing this is that, women organize together for many things, for healthcare, for political support, for just, learning about their bodies, learning about health issues that affected women.
Mm-hmm.
But men, and in a way, I have to, I'm a man. I have male children, and I have to take some responsibility that we don't come together as easily or as effectively as women. And I think that's beginning to change. You talk about what's changing. I know in my own case, my work over the years, about, I guess, 3 or 4 years ago, I
Mm-hmm.
brought together some leaders in the men's health field that I realized there were now many, many programs for men, but they were fairly disparate and isolated.
Mm-hmm.
And I put together what I called our moonshot for mankind and humanity to help focus and bring together men and men's organizations, which included women who are leading organizations that are helping men. It isn't just men helping men's organizations. Women are involved too, just like men were involved in helping support women. So I'm wondering, in terms of just maybe as we're looking towards what can be done, what might it take to recognize that we need to come together as men, and perhaps also in the political realm, come together as men to put influence on the political parties that we want to influence, to be able to get, not instead of women's issues, but because men's and women's issues are intimately related, that we create positive issues that will help men and women.
Well, those are two really, really good and important questions. And it would be great if there was just a really simple, short answer to either of them. But you hit the nail on the head. I think those are just the two really key things. And I think doing the first will help a lot to the second. So I've heard it described that politicians wait for the parade to form, then they go stand in front and grab the baton and walk in front of it, right? So if you have a large group of men or male advocates, which includes men and women, for all different types of issues, I think what you will see is that politicians will start to listen. So the answer to your first question, being successful in getting men and others together to be organized for male advocacy will help with the political part of it. Now, how do we get more people to advocate for male well-being? I think one of the most important things to do is to understand the interconnectedness of all these different issues. Because I think what happens is a lot of times people say, "Oh, I have this one issue. You don't understand. It's the family courts. The family courts took my kids away. They threw me in jail. They took away my driver's license. And like, it's the family court. We need to do everything we can to stop the family court." That person is completely correct that that issue for them was, that really harmed them and harmed their whole family's lives. But what they don't necessarily understand is the broader picture of all the different issues that affect men and how that's just one. How do they see that, how is that connected to male life expectancy or deaths of despair? How is that connected to low educational outcomes for boys? So, for instance, boys without a father in the home have worse educational outcomes than boys with a father in the home. So, if he's separated from his family and the courts are not letting him see his family, his sons are going to have worse educational outcomes from school. So, it's sometimes challenging to do it, especially when you talk to somebody who is dealing with something that's life changing, like being separated from their kids. And then you try to say, this is part of a larger movement. They're going to be very focused on the issue that's right at hand, understandably, too, right? Understandably. So, but I think understanding the systemic nature of so many of these issues and how they also help women, as you said, and that everyone is connected and what's good for the goose is good for the gander and vice versa. I think if people understand that, that'll help get support too. So those are the couple of thoughts I have in terms of A, getting more male advocacy organized, and B, then getting that organized advocacy, onto the plates of the politicians. So they see there's a benefit for them that they're going to get votes, because politicians are kind of like business people, but they deal in votes. So they're going to look at their budget. They're going to look at how many votes they need to win office so they're back in the office the next time. How many people live in my district? How many people vote? What do they vote on? That's what gets the attention.
Indeed. And so we have, as you and I are talking today, an election for the presidency coming up in November. And as you well know, when you wrote this book, and again, just hold it up again just to let people see it, and we'll talk about where people can get it in a bit. But at the time, the Democratic candidate that was likely to be the nominee for the Democrat presidential nominee was Joe Biden. And at the time, and still now, the Republican likely nominee was Donald Trump. So in a way, there were two aging white males that were competing with different people favoring one or the other. Well, that's changed obviously since then, and now the Democratic nominee is Kamala Harris. And so there's a now, I think, unique opportunity for those who have a desire to support women's issues in a very tangible way. Obviously, if Kamala Harris becomes the president, it will be a first for the United States. And many believe that she and Tim Walz, the Democratic vice presidential candidate, would be a very good option for helping males and females. So you talk about in the book, and I'd like you to kind of hone in on this, because I think it's really a critically important kind of metric that can, in fact, turn an election, which is, I think everybody knows the election will turn on a small number of votes in certain key states and certain key districts. And that you have a metric that you came up with from looking at the statistics on past elections that show that it doesn't take too much of a shift of getting more males to vote Democrat to shift areas and election results. So talk a little bit about that critical number that doesn't take too much to shift, and how that could change any election, but particularly the one that we're getting ready to vote in soon.
Sure. And one thing I got to say too, as we start this, the data that we get about voting by gender is all polling data. And we know that polls are not perfect, but the exit polls that are conducted are not just one moment in time. They conduct an exit poll on election day, and then they, over 6 weeks, they continue to sample and refine it till they get. So different polls are going to give you different numbers. For my book, I use the most commonly used network polls that all the networks get together and they use the same exit poll because it would be too hard for them all to do it separately. So Edison Research is the name of the company that does that. So using that data for the last 5 election cycles and similar types of data going before, the Democrats have never lost an election for president since 1972, when they have lost 8% of the vote, of the male vote, or less. So that is if they have done no worse than losing men by 8%, which is not even that good. Like -8 is actually pretty bad, right? So they've got a little leeway there. And contrarily, whenever it's been less than that, they have lost every single election. So for instance, in 2016, Hillary Clinton, the polling data indicated that she lost men by 11%. So that's below that 8% threshold. Whereas in 2020, President Biden, or now President Biden, he won. He got just at about -8%. So he just barely got over that line. But here's another important factor that people need to realize. Also, every single time that the Democrats have been in the White House, when they've been the incumbent party, whether it's an incumbent candidate or just the incumbent party, they have declined among male support the following election because essentially the Democratic Party gets in power and then they follow their platform, which has no focus on male issues, and then they lose among men the next time. And then they went, why didn't they vote for us again? We thought we were doing well, but they're not focusing on the male social issues to the degree that I believe they should, and that I believe would help them. So that's the challenge this year. If the Democrats were already at -8, again, according to this one poll, you might see a lot of different gender gap polls this year. In fact, Washington Monthly just started what I've seen the first ever gender gap tracker. So the first time. So that really shows that this whole gender gap concept is really a big item this year. But the exact number is going to be tricky. And again, it's like Wall Street, right? Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. But, long story short, Democrats can't really do worse than -8. And even if they do -8, that's not even a guarantee. And they should try to do -4% or even just break even among the male voters. If they can just go 50-50 in the swing states and nationally, they will win Congress and the White House. That's all they need to do. And when you know that that's the number, those are the facts, and then you look at their platform with 82 mentions of women and only 4 mentions of men, it just, as a Democrat, you can't help but be a little frustrated by that.
Well, I think for me, the take home from all of this, for me personally, is that if we want to recognize that our voice, meaning male voices and women voices that have a desire to get the best person elected for office at all levels, but in this case, the presidency,
Mhm.
our issues are important and our voices are important. And that I think, as we kind of bring it back to where we began this little interview, that this seems to be a time where men's issues are coming to the fore. There, as you know, there was a new American Institute for Boys and Men
Mhm.
that is recently formed. Richard Reeves, who wrote a book about it, I interviewed in a previous podcast. And so these organizations, I think if we recognize 2 things, if we recognize there's some real benefit now to using our political vote and our desire to organize to get our voices heard, this can make a huge difference. And not only can we hopefully get our person of choice elected, but we can also send a message to the political parties that say that you need to listen to us because we and you know the data will show, as it has, and you've drawn it together, that if we organize and if we come together in support of candidates that we feel are going to be good for men and women and children, and we can win, I think the next rounds, or in all the different ways that we want to influence, we can show that men's issues are important and that men can come together with women on issues that affect us all and can make a difference politically. So I think the message I want to put out, and I think you do too, is we don't have to wait for the parties, the Democratic or any parties, to be responsive to men, because I don't think either party has been particularly responsive in their platforms and so on to issues that I think are not only important to men, but men in our families. But we can take our influence in our own hands as women did, and I
Hmm.
remember that quote that women, when they started becoming politically active, said the personal is political. By really dealing with the issues that affect us personally, that in itself is a political act. And as we organize towards bringing our voices together, that can have an influence on the politics of the future. So uh, I would have you perhaps kind of tell us, because this will go live fairly soon and people will be able to check in with you, where they can find out about the book, where they can find out about some of the issues and some of the important things that you talk about in the book, and how to follow your work and what you're doing both now and in the future.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah. So the book again is called How Democrats Can Win Back Men, and it is available on Amazon. And my middle initial is W. So search for Mark W. Sutton, How Democrats Can Win Back Men. I've also got a website, which is mark-sutton.com. And you can connect with me there. I'd love to hear from you if you want to shoot me an email. My email is on the website. And you can also go to my Substack, which is linked from the website. It is called Men and the 2024 Election, which I started a year ago before the men's issues were such a big part of this election. So it's been exciting to see that. So again, the Substack is called Men and the 2024 Election. So that's the best way to reach me. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, Jed, thank you so much for having me today.
Good. Well, I'm glad to be there. I'll just kind of hold the book up so people can get a quick, look at it. It's a great title. It's again, How Democrats Can Win Back Men, and it's Mark W. Sutton, Sutton, so people can find you if they didn't write it down, or I will put the information out too when I post this information to my website and online. So again, Mark, thanks so much for being with us today, and we'll say goodbye for now.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Jed.
Thanks.